March 23, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the ancient waterway that has stood as Europe's natural fortress for 2,000 years. Roman legions once halted at its banks. Napoleon's armies faltered at its crossing. Now, in the dying days of the Third Reich, German commanders peer through field glasses from fortified positions on the eastern shore, watching the Allied forces mass on the opposite bank. They have destroyed every bridge for 50 miles. They have mined the approaches. They have positioned their remaining panzer divisions and artillery battalions to turn the river into a killing ground. The Rhine, they believe, will buy them time. Perhaps weeks, perhaps enough to sue for favorable terms. Then, through the morning mist, something impossible appears on the water's surface. Not landing craft, not pontoon bridges. Tanks. American Sherman tanks, moving across the river under their own power, churning through the current like steel leviathans. Their guns already turning toward the German positions. In that moment, watching the laws of warfare rewrite themselves before their eyes, the German officers understand they are witnessing not just a tactical innovation, but the material manifestation of American industrial imagination, a nation that refuses to accept the limitations of terrain, tradition, or natural law. The amphibious tank was not born on the Rhine. Its genesis reaches back to 1941, to the drawing boards of American military engineers, confronting a strategic reality that would define the entire war. The coming conflict would be fought across oceans, islands, rivers, and coastlines. Traditional tanks, for all their armored might, become a 30-ton paperweights. At the water's edge, British forces had experimented with flotation devices during the disastrous Dieppe raid of 1942, watching their modified tanks sink like stones or bog down in the surf, their crews drowning in steel coffins. The Japanese had developed crude amphibious designs for their Pacific campaigns, but these were light reconnaissance vehicles, barely armored, easily destroyed. What America proposed was something audacious. A fully functional medium tank that could transition from naval assault vessel to armored cavalry without pause, without vulnerability, without the chaos of troops wading through killing zones while waiting for armor support. The DED tank. Duplex drive-in official nomenclature, Donald Duck and soldier slang. Merged from this requirement, British engineer Nicholas Straussler provided the initial design concept, but American industrial capacity transformed it from prototype to production. The system seemed almost whimsical in its simplicity. A collapsible canvas screen, 36 feet in circumference, when raised, attached to the tank's hull and supported by inflatable rubber tubes. Twin propellers mounted at the rear, driven by the tank's engine through a power transfer system. When the screen was raised, the Sherman tank, all 33 tons of it, became a floating vessel drawing just over 3 feet of water. The freeboard stood at only 2 feet above the waterline. In anything but calm conditions, this margin dissolved into terror. The crews christened their vessels with sardonic humor. The floating coffin, the canvas casket, drowning Dora. German military doctrine, forged in the crucible of Prussian tradition and refined through the lightning victories of 1939 to 1941, held certain truths to be immutable. Rivers were barriers. Crossings required engineers, bridging equipment, time, and exposure. Armor waited for infantry to secure the far shore. This was how war had always been conducted. This was the mathematics of military geography. When German intelligence first reported Allied experiments with swimming tanks in the months before the reports were filed alongside other unlikely Allied schemes, the inflatable dummy armies, the the technological fantasies of a nation that seemed to approach war like a Hollywood production. Generalmajor Wilhelm Falle, commanding the 91st Air Landing Division in Normandy, dismissed the concept outright when briefed. The Americans, he told his staff, had been watching too many of their own movies. He would be dead within hours of the Normandy invasion, killed by American paratroopers before he could witness the DD tanks swimming ashore at Utah Beach. The performance of the amphibious Germans on D-Day painted a complex portrait of technological promise and practical limitation at Utah Beach, where commerces prevailed. 28 DD tanks launched 2,000 yards from shore. 20 Sivan reached the beach, their guns firing within minutes of landing, providing crucial support to infantry companies struggling across open sand. At Omaha Beach, the story turned tragic. Launched in heavy seas, 6,000 yards offshore, 27 of 32 DD tanks sank before reaching land, their crews scrambling from hatches as canvas screens collapsed and water poured in. 120 men drowned in their vehicles or in the waves. Yet even in failure, the concept proved its strategic value. The 5 tanks that reached Omaha provided the only armored support for the first critical hour. Their presence perhaps making the difference between bloody victory and catastrophic defeat. The German soldiers who survived contact with these amphibious apparitions carried stories back through the collapsing Wehrmacht that took on almost mythological dimensions. Oberstleutnant Hans Heinrichs, a machine gunner with the 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach, wrote in his diary, "We believed we had stopped them at the waterline. Then tanks emerged from the sea itself, already firing. It was as if Neptune had turned against us, arming the waves." The psychological impact transcended the tactical. German defensive doctrine depended on channeling enemy forces into predetermined killing zones, when the enemy's armor could simply bypass natural obstacles. When rivers and coastlines ceased to function as defensive barriers, the entire strategic calculus dissolved. The German military mind, trained in the lessons of Clausewitz and Schlieffen, operated within parameters of terrain and logistics. The Americans, it seemed, simply invented new parameters when the old ones proved inconvenient. After Normandy, American engineers refined their designs, learning from the cruel lessons of Omaha Beach. Weighting equipment for Sherman's improved dramatically. Extensions and waterproofed engines allowed standard tanks to operate in 6 feet of water. But the DD variants remained in production, their role evolving from seaborne assault to river crossing operations. By early 1945, as Allied armies pressed into Germany, the amphibious Shermans found their true calling. Germany is a land of rivers. The Roe, the Saar, the Moselle, the Main, and finally, the Rhine itself, the great historical barrier. The river that had defined Germanic identity since antiquity. Each river represented a defensive line, a chance to slow the Allied advance, to extract time from terrain. The German High Command, by March of 1945, clung to the Rhine as their final, coherent defensive position. Everything west of the river had been abandoned or was in the process of collapse. But the Rhine was different. The Rhine was sacrosanct. Generalist Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, issued orders to defend the river to the last man, to the last bullet. Hitler raved about Alpine fortresses and miracle weapons, but his generals focused on the Rhine. They had destroyed the bridges at Cologne, Koblenz, Bonn, and Mainz. Only the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had fallen intact into American hands, a catastrophe for which Hitler ordered 4 officers executed. But that was a single crossing point. The Rhine remained. The Rhine would hold. Then came March 23rd and Operation Plunder, the British-American assault across the Rhine north of the Ruhr. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, never one for subtle maneuvers, orchestrated a massive set-piece crossing involving 280,000 troops, 3,000 artillery pieces, and the largest airborne operation since D-Day. But while Montgomery's forces executed their elaborate ballet of smokescreens and artillery barrages, American forces under General George Patton were already across. Patton's Third Army had bounced the Rhine at Oppenheim the night before, using assault boats in sheer audacity. And now, in daylight, the DD tanks churned across, docents of Tem, their canvas screens raised, propellers thrashing, moving through water that German doctrine said should protect them. Altmann, Friedrich Boimer, commanded a battery of 88mm anti-tank guns, positioned on the high ground east of the Rhine crossing sites. His written account, preserved in U.S. Army interrogation files, captures the moment. We observed what we believed to be assault boats, very large ones, approaching the center of the river. We prepared to engage once they neared the shore, as they would be vulnerable during the landing. Then we realized these were not boats. The shapes were wrong. Someone shouted Panzer, but that made no sense. A corporal insisted he could see tank tracks in the water. We thought he had lost his mind. When the first vehicle reached the shallows, the canvas structure lowered, and a Sherman tank drove directly onto the shore and began firing. We were still trying to comprehend what we had witnessed when 3 more emerged from the river behind it. The American talent for mechanical improvisation had reached a form of insanity. They had built tanks that defied nature itself. The German expectation, shaped by 3 years of defensive warfare, was that river crossings would follow predictable patterns. First came the artillery preparation, the smoke, the aerial bombardment, then infantry and assault boats, suffering casualties as they crossed. Engineers would follow, struggling to construct floating bridges under fire. Only hours later, perhaps the next day, would armor arrive. This sequence gave defenders time to concentrate forces, to maneuver reserves, to exact maximum costs for every yard gained. The amphibious Sherman collapsed this timetable into minutes. Infantry, boats, and armor arrived simultaneously. Defensive positions planned to engage landing craft suddenly faced tank guns firing from the water itself. German crews trained to destroy armor on solid ground found themselves aiming at targets that bobbed and weaved with the current. Canvas screens obscuring the actual hull. Distance and angle calculations rendered meaningless by the target's movement. The technological achievement represented more than engineering cleverness. It embodied a distinctly American approach to warfare, the conviction that material abundance and industrial innovation could overcome any obstacle. Where European armies saw the Rhine and calculated the cost of crossing in thousands of lives, American planners saw a problem requiring a mechanical solution. The DAT tank was not elegant. It was not refined. Crews hated the cramped conditions. The terror of floating in a steel box, barely above the waterline. The knowledge that a single large wave or artillery strike could send them to the bottom. But it worked. And in working, it presented the German military mind with an opponent that refused to accept the traditional limitations of warfare. The symbolic weight of the Rhine crossing extended beyond military significance. For Germans, the Rhine was not merely a river but the liquid spine of their national identity. Countless paintings depicted its castles and vineyards. The Lorelei siren sang from its rocks, in German legend. Nazi propaganda had portrayed it as an eternal barrier between Germanic civilization and the chaos of the West. When Hitler stood before maps in his Berlin bunker, the Rhine represented more than a defensive lunette. It was a psychological barrier, the final proof that Germany could still resist. The sight of American tanks motoring across it like pleasure boats on a summer afternoon shattered something fundamental in the German military consciousness. If the Rhine could not stop them, nothing could. If Americans could make tanks swim, what other impossibilities might they achieve? The canvas flotation screen became, in those final weeks of the European War, a recurring image in German soldier. Hakunsei, symbol of American material excess. A mechanical audacity, a Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured during the Ruhr pocket encirclement, told his interrogators, "You Americans fight with money and machines. You throw steel and gasoline at problems until they disappear. We fight with will and doctrine. You invented tanks that float because you could, not because you needed to. You had the rubber for the tubes, the canvas for the screens, the engineers to design them, the factories to build them, the ships to transport them. We could barely keep our remaining panzers fueled." There was bitterness in his words, but also a kind of exhausted admiration. The German war machine, forged in the fires of ideological fervor and tactical brilliance, had been overwhelmed by an opponent that approached conflict as an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions. That the transformation in German military assessment occurred not as a sudden revelation but as a gradual, demoralizing accumulation of evidence. Each encounter with American technological innovation added another weight to the psychological burden. The proximity fuse that made artillery deadly beyond historical norms. The logistics system that kept armies supplied across thousands of miles. The fighter escorts that darkened European skies. The Liberty ships that replaced sunk tonnage faster than U-boats could sink them. And now, tanks that swam. General Magyar, Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal, reflected in his post-war memoir, We understood by 1943 that we would likely lose the war, but until the Rhine crossings, we believed we might negotiate. Toms might preserve something of Germany. When we saw American armor cross the Rhine without pause, without the expected casualties, without granting us the time that river crossings should provide, we knew the end would be total. An enemy that could make tanks float was not an enemy that would negotiate. They would simply invent solutions until victory was complete. The DD tank saw its final significant action during the Rhine crossings of March and April 1945. By month's end, Allied armies were ranging across Germany, the river barrier broken beyond repair. The amphibious Shermans had served their purpose. Most were converted back to standard configuration or relegated to training roles. The war ended 6 weeks after the Rhine crossings, and the swimming tanks became historical footnotes, remembered primarily by the men who crewed them and the Germans who watched them emerge impossibly from European rivers. The design influenced post-war amphibious vehicle development, but the DD tank itself faded from military inventories. A specialized answer to a specific wartime problem. Yet the image persisted in the historical record, those canvas-skirted Shermans churning across the Rhine, propellers driving them through current, tank commanders standing in their turrets scanning for targets even before reaching shore. The image captured something essential about the American war effort in Europe. A democracy that approached total war not through ideology or martial tradition, but through industrial capacity and mechanical innovation. Where Nazi Germany built its military power on racial hierarchy and warrior mystery, America built its on factory production lines and engineering. The DD tank was absurd. It was impractical. It violated the understood principles of armored warfare, and it worked. The terror German generals felt was not the immediate fear of battlefield. Defeat by March 1945. Defeat was inevitable regardless of technology. It was the deeper terror of confronting an opponent whose approach to warfare was fundamentally alien to their experience. German military doctrine had evolved over centuries, refined through the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian conflict, the trenches of World War I. It valued training, tradition, tactical excellence, the forging of will through hardship. The American military, by contrast, was barely more than a decade old in its modern form, an institution that had to be rebuilt almost from scratch after Pearl Harbor. Yet this young military, this improvised force, had produced tank flotation systems, computerized bombs, mass-produced carriers and Liberty ships, proximity-fused shells, and 100 other innovations born not from military tradition but from American industrial culture. The same culture that had given the world assembly lines in Hollywood and jazz. The canvas screen, that simple scud of waterproofed fabric held aloft by rubber tubes, became in German eyes a symbol of American abundance, taken to grotesque extremes. That the Americans could spare the rubber for thousands of flotation tubes, the canvas for hundreds of screens, the engineering hours to design and test the systems, the shipping capacity to transport them across the Atlantic, the training time to teach crews to operate them, all this for a device that would be used for perhaps an hour in each tank's service life, spoke to an economy of scale beyond German comprehension. General Magay, Fritz Bayerlein, captured commander of the Panzer-Lehr division, summarized the German perspective in his interrogation. We were told the Americans were soft, that they relied on material because they lacked spirit. Perhaps that was true. But they had so much material that spirit became irrelevant. They built tanks that floated because they could afford to waste resources on experimental ideas. We built tanks that fought brilliantly because we had no choice but perfection. In the end, their waste defeated our efficiency. The Rhine crossing marked a psychological punctuation in the European war. The moment when even the most fanatical German defenders recognized that further resistance meant only additional destruction, not altered outcome. The amphibious Shermans did not win the war. They did not turn the tide of battle. What they did was remove the last plausible justification for German military resistance. Rivers would not save them. Alpine redoubts would not shelter them. The Americans would simply invent solutions, build the necessary equipment, and continue advancing. Surrender became not an admission of moral or military inferiority, but a recognition of industrial reality. In the post-war years, As German officers wrote their memoirs and historians compiled their assessments, the amphibious Sherman appeared again and again as a symbol of the war's broader meaning. The conflict had not been decided by battlefield valor or tactical brilliance, though. Both existed in abundance on all sides. It had been decided by industrial capacity and democratic resilience. The DD tank, for all its tactical limitations and operational quirks, represented a truth about democratic warfare that totalitarian militarism could not counter. Free societies, when threatened, can harness their citizens' creativity and their economies' productive power to generate solutions faster than traditional military hierarchies can conceive of problems. The last sight of those canvas-skirted Shermans, churning across German rivers in the spring of 1945, carried a message that transcended military tactics. It was a message about the nature of power in the modern world, about the ultimate futility of militarism divorced from industrial capacity, about the victory of pragmatic innovation over ideological purity. The German generals, watching through their field glasses as American tanks violated the ancient defensive sanctity of Europe's rivers, understood in that moment not just that they would lose, the war many had suspected that for years, but that they had been defeated by a fundamentally different conception of warfare itself, one that viewed rivers not as barriers, but as problems that could be solved not through tactics or courage or will, but through rubber tubes and canvas screens and American industrial confidence. The terror they felt was the terror of the obsolete confronting the inevitable, of military tradition meeting mechanical future, of discovering that in total war between industrial nations, the side that can make its tanks swim will always cross the river, always advance, always win, not through superiority of spirit or doctrine, but through the simple, devastating application of abundance to the problems of war.